My son banned me from Christmas dinner. Then the entire family saw me on live national news. My name is Pamela. I am 74 years old, and 3 weeks before Christmas, my own son looked me in the eye and told me I was no longer welcome at his table. Not because I was sick. Not because I was cruel. Because I was, in his words, an embarrassment to the family image. I want you to remember that sentence because by the end of this story, that same family was sitting on their couch watching me on live national television, and every single one of them had to explain to their friends why they'd spent the last year pretending I didn't exist. Before I go any further, if you're the kind of person who believes family should never be allowed to make you feel small, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel, because this story is going to make your blood boil before it makes you stand up and cheer. I tell these stories because I lived one myself, and I promised the woman I used to be that I would never stay quiet again. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you exactly how a 74-year-old widow with nothing but a modest pension and a stubborn streak became the person her son's entire social circle couldn't stop talking about. Let me back up. My husband Walter passed away 6 years ago. 41 years of marriage, gone in one hospital hallway on a Tuesday afternoon. Walter and I built a small but comfortable life. He was an electrician I taught 3rd grade for 32 years, and together we raised one son, a boy I will call Bradley in this story because his real name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what he became. Bradley grew up watching his father come home with grease under his fingernails, and his mother grading spelling tests at the kitchen table until midnight. We weren't rich. We were steady. We paid for his college, we co-signed his first car loan, and when he married a woman I'll call Cheryl, we sold Walter's old fishing boat to help pay for the wedding venue because Cheryl wanted something with a view. I liked Cheryl at first. She was polished, ambitious, the kind of woman who color-coded her closet and always knew the right thing to say at a dinner party. It took me a few years to understand that Cheryl didn't actually like people who reminded her of where Bradley came from. And nothing reminded her of that more than me. It started small. An eye roll when I brought a casserole to a party instead of something from a bakery downtown. A comment about my outdated cardigans in front of her friends. Then it got specific. Cheryl worked in local event planning and had started climbing into a circle of women whose husbands ran businesses, sat on charity boards, the kind of people who host garden parties for the local paper's society page. And somewhere along the way, I became a liability to that image. I found out I'd been quietly excluded from things before I was ever told directly. My granddaughter's dance recital I heard about a week after it happened, from a neighbor who saw the photos on Facebook. A family barbecue with Bradley's new business partners. I wasn't invited because Cheryl said it was adults only, except my sister-in-law was there, and she's my age. Little cuts. The kind that don't bleed enough for anyone to notice but leave scars all the same. Then came Thanksgiving. I showed up with my green bean casserole, same recipe I'd made for 30 years, and Cheryl met me at the door before I even got my coat off. She said very sweetly that they decided to streamline the guest list this year, and maybe it would be better if I just came by another time to see the grandkids. Not that day. Another time. I stood on that porch in the cold holding a warm dish, and I smiled and said, "Of course, dear." And I drove home and I cried in my car for 45 minutes before I could see well enough to pull out of the driveway. I told myself it was a one-time thing. A misunderstanding. I was wrong. 3 weeks before Christmas, Bradley called me. Not Cheryl. Bradley. My own son, the boy I nursed through chickenpox and taught to ride a bike and sat with in the emergency room the night he broke his arm falling off our garage roof at 15. He called me and, after some throat clearing and long pauses, he told me that this year Christmas dinner was going to be a smaller, more curated gathering. He said Cheryl's business relationships were becoming important to their future, that they were hosting some influential people from her firm, and that honestly, Mom, it might just be easier if I didn't come this year. I asked him straight out, "Are you telling me I'm not welcome at my own son's house for Christmas?" He didn't answer right away. And that silence told me everything his words were too cowardly to say. I said okay. I said I understood. I hung up the phone and I sat in my kitchen in the house Walter and I bought in 1987, at the table where I'd fed that boy 1,000 breakfasts, and I let myself feel every ounce of it. The grief, the humiliation, the disbelief that the people I gave my whole life to could look at me and see an embarrassment. But here's the thing about being 74 years old, about having buried a husband and raised a child and survived 32 years of other people's difficult children in a classroom. You learn that self-pity has a shelf life, and mine was about to expire. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened next. I wasn't always just Bradley's mother or Walter's widow. Before I was either of those things, I spent 4 years from age 22 to 26 volunteering and later working part-time for a regional emergency response organization, doing community disaster relief coordination. It's how Walter and I actually met at a flood relief site in 1974. I kept that skill set alive my whole life in small ways, volunteering with the Red Cross during hurricane season, helping organize supply drives after tornadoes hit towns 2 counties over. It was never something my son's new friends would have found impressive. It didn't come with a title or a corner office. But it was real and it mattered and it was mine. That December, a terrible ice storm hit our region. The kind that knocks out power for 100,000 households and turns highways into sheets of glass. I'd been part of the volunteer coordination network for our county for over a decade at that point. And when the call went out for experienced volunteers to help organize an emergency shelter and warming center at the community center downtown, I didn't hesitate. Christmas Eve, the day I was supposed to be sitting alone in my quiet house instead of at my son's table, I was instead pulling on my coat and driving to the community center to help set up cots and coordinate supply drop-offs for over 200 displaced families. I worked that shelter for nearly 18 hours straight. I organized volunteers half my age. I comforted a young mother whose apartment building had lost heat with 3 kids under 6. I helped an elderly man who reminded me achingly of Walter find his estranged daughter through a missing persons board we'd set up. And somewhere around 10 o'clock that night, exhausted, hair a mess, wearing a borrowed volunteer vest 2 sizes too big, I looked up and saw a news van pulling into the parking lot. A local news crew had come to cover the storm's impact, and they were looking for someone who could speak to what the shelter was doing. The shelter director, a wonderful woman named Diane who'd worked beside me all night, pointed the reporter straight at me. "Talk to Pamela," she said. "She's been running point on logistics since 6 this morning. She's the reason 200 people have hot food tonight." I almost said no. 74 years old, no makeup, hands raw from hauling blankets. But then I thought about my son's silence on that phone call, about being called an embarrassment, about a lifetime of making myself smaller, so I wouldn't take up too much space in other people's curated images. And something in me said, no, not tonight. Tonight I have something to say. I stood in front of that camera in my volunteer vest, and I spoke plainly, the way I used to speak to my 3rd graders when I needed them to really understand something. I talked about the families who'd walked in shivering with children wrapped in whatever blankets they could grab. I talked about neighbors helping neighbors, about how disaster doesn't care what your job title is or how big your house is. It only cares whether someone shows up for you when the lights go out. I said that on the coldest night of the year, the people who mattered most weren't the ones with the fanciest parties. They were the ones willing to get up at 5 in the morning and stay past midnight because someone needed a warm place to sleep. I had no idea, standing there, that the segment would run not just on our local affiliate, but that the footage would be picked up by a national morning news network the very next day as part of a larger story on the ice storm's impact across 3 states. I had no idea that somewhere across town, in a beautifully decorated dining room full of Cheryl's influential work friends, someone would glance at their phone during dessert, see a clip circulating online and say, "Wait, isn't that Bradley's mother?" Christmas morning my phone would not stop ringing. The first call was from my niece, half laughing, half stunned, telling me I was all over her social media feed, that people were sharing the clip with captions like "This is what community looks like and faith in humanity restored." The second call was from an old teaching colleague who saw the segment air on the national morning show and immediately recognized me. By noon, the local paper had picked up the story too, running a piece with the headline "Grandmother, 74, coordinates Christmas Eve shelter for storm victims." They used a photo of me hugging that little girl whose family had lost heat. I looked tired and rumpled and honestly prouder than I'd felt in years. The third call, the one I want to tell you about, came at 2:47 in the afternoon. It was Bradley. His voice was different than it had been 3 weeks earlier. Smaller somehow. He said Cheryl's colleagues had been talking about the story all through their curated Christmas dinner, not knowing the woman in the clip was his mother, until his own aunt posted about it and tagged our family name. He said people at that table, the very influential people Cheryl had reorganized Christmas around impressing, had spent 20 minutes praising the woman on television for her selflessness and community spirit. And then someone had turned to Bradley and asked, with great interest, whether he was related to her. He asked if I'd seen the news. I told him yes, of course I had. I was there, dear, I lived it. There was a long pause, and then he asked quietly why I hadn't told him what I'd been planning to do that night. I said, Bradley, you didn't ask what I was doing for Christmas. You told me I wasn't invited to yours. I let that sit for a moment, the way I used to let a hard truth sit with a student who needed to actually hear it rather than just be told it. Then I said something I'd been holding in for years, something I finally had the strength to say out loud. I told him that I had spent his whole life making myself smaller so that he and Cheryl could feel bigger, and that I was done doing that. I told him I loved him and I would always love him, but that I would not spend the rest of my life apologizing for existing in a way that didn't match somebody's Pinterest board. He didn't have a response for that. Not really. He mumbled something about how it wasn't like that, but we both knew it absolutely was like that. In the weeks that followed, something interesting happened. The story kept traveling. A regional charity reached out and asked me to speak at their spring fundraising gala about grassroots disaster response. A community college invited me to guest lecture in their emergency management program about coordinating volunteer logistics on the ground. I started getting messages from women my age, and younger women too, telling me that watching a 74-year-old woman stand in front of a camera and speak with quiet authority had made them feel like they still had something to offer the world. One woman wrote that her own daughter-in-law had been treating her similarly, and that seeing my story gave her the courage to have a hard conversation of her own. Cheryl, for her part, went very quiet on social media for a while. I heard through my niece that some of her new influential friends had started asking pointed questions, the kind that make a person uncomfortable, like why Bradley's accomplished mother hadn't been at their Christmas table in the first place. Funny how quickly people's curated images crack when the truth becomes more interesting than the performance. Bradley came to see me in January alone without Cheryl. He sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd fed him breakfast for 18 years, and he apologized. A real apology, not the deflecting kind. He said he'd let his marriage and his wife's ambitions reshape what he thought mattered, and that watching strangers respect his mother more than he had in years had forced him to take a hard look at himself. I didn't make it easy for him. I told him that respect isn't something you get to reclaim just because the wind changed direction. I told him actions build trust slowly, the same way they tear it down quickly. We're rebuilding, Bradley and I, slowly, carefully. He visits now without Cheryl sometimes, which tells you something. My grandchildren come over on weekends, and I've started teaching my granddaughter, who's 11, how to bake the same green bean casserole that got quietly rejected at that door 3 weeks before Christmas. She thinks it's the best thing she's ever tasted. I told her that's because it's made with the recipe, and also with the part of me nobody can shrink down anymore. As for that Christmas dinner I wasn't invited to, I heard it wasn't quite the triumphant evening Cheryl had planned. Word travels fast in small social circles, and by dessert, most of the conversation wasn't about the business connections she'd hoped to make. It was about the grandmother who wasn't there, the one everyone had just watched on the national news, coordinating a shelter for 200 cold, frightened families while they ate off good china and talked about themselves. I think about that phone call from Bradley a lot, the first one, the one where he called me an embarrassment without quite saying the word out loud. I think about how easy it would have been to spend that Christmas Eve at home feeling sorry for myself, waiting for an apology that might never have come. Instead, I put on a coat, drove to a community center, and reminded myself of something I'd forgotten for a little while, that my worth was never something my son or his wife had the authority to decide. It never was. It was mine all along, same as it is for every one of you watching this. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been made to feel small by people who were supposed to make you feel loved, I want you to do 2 things. First, like this video and subscribe, because there are more stories like mine coming, and every single one of them ends with someone finding their strength again. Second, I want you to remember this. You don't need anyone's permission to matter. Not your children, not your in-laws, not anyone sitting at a table deciding who gets to belong. Go be the person who shows up when the lights go out. The rest has a way of working itself out. I'm Pamela. Thank you for listening to my story. I'll see you in the next one.